So my name is Asher Miller, and I'm the executive director of Post Carbon Institute. I'm here with Nate Hagens, the person I always turn to when I want to better understand the relationship between energy and the financial markets and the overall economy. Just a quick background, Nate is the co-founder of the Institute for the Study of Energy in the Future. He's an adjunct professor at University of Minnesota and a fellow at Post Carbon Institute. He left his career on Wall Street to get a PhD in ecological economics and was a longtime editor of the popular website, The Oil Drum. Before we start, Nate, I just want to put a quick timestamp on this conversation since the situation is changing so quickly. So we're talking at 10 a.m. Pacific time on March 16th. And, you know, I should check again, but last time I saw, the stock markets are down again precipitously today. I think the major markets in the US are down something like between 25 and 30% just the past month. Oil prices are also totally cratering. I think West Texas Intermediate is down below $30 a barrel right now. I think that's the first time in a while. And people are warning of demand reduction on the likes of, things we haven't seen since before the Great Recession, really. So, welcome, Nate. Thanks for taking the time to talk. Before we get into what's happening right now, I just want to back it up a little bit because you've been speaking, I think, and studying for a while now, sort of maybe we would call this systemic risks in the financial market since 2008, since the Great Recession hit. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe we could talk about what's happening right now and what the situation right now means and with regard to those risks?
Yeah, I mean, this is a systemic story about the human predicament. And humans are biological organisms. We self-organize with families, small businesses, corporations, nations, the whole global system around procuring financial surplus. And financial surplus is linked to energy, which is linked to fossil energy, which is linked to CO2 and other pollution. And we need more and more energy every quarter, every year to grow. If we run into problems, we kind of paper over those problems by creating monetary representations of our underlying energy and materials. And since you and I have been alive, we have every single year created more financial representations relative to GDP than we've grown our GDP. So we keep creating larger and larger paper and digital claims on our reality, and that's unsustainable. So we've basically been living beyond our means for 50 years or so, and the relationship between energy and finance has to recalibrate at some point. And so this virus, any crisis, including this virus, they don't so much create the problems themselves, they just highlight problems that already existed. And we're seeing that already. As you said, this is March 16th, but people are becoming aware of income inequality. People at Amazon and Microsoft can work at home, no problem. But what about the people at coffee shops or tattoo artists or people in the transportation industry? I mean, they can't work at all. So there's this bifurcated economy, point number one. Point number two, we have this giant financial leverage that existed before 2008, but we bailed out Wall Street and the banks and created too big to fail guarantees, artificially low interest rates, quantitative easing, all kinds of financial temporary measures, which here 11 years later still exist and are even larger. So there's lots of problems with the underlying ability of the human economy to grow. And as soon as we can no longer grow, then the financial system becomes the first line in the sand that we have to deal with.
Yeah, talk more about that because we at Post Carbon Institute, we talk a lot about sort of the unsustainability of the current economic system, right? A lot of it, we talk about the relationship between energy and the economy, how dependent we are on fossil fuels, how much we, how much exponential growth there has been with human population and consumption and economic activity, and how we created these systems that sort of anticipate that that's just going to continue forever, right? Um, and we've been warning people about, in particular, the dangers of our dependence on fossil fuels. But in all that time, when we've had conversations, you've talked a lot about maybe the the most acute risk, or the piece of the picture that's going to fall the first is the financial system. So why is that?
Well, because people don't, even though we use energy for everything, all the goods and services that contribute to GDP require energy conversions. But people are energy blind in our culture. They think of their monthly utility bill, or when they fill up their car, how much it costs. So they think in financial terms. So we keep creating money and financial representations of things, whereas our high quality, low entropy energy and materials are declining. So if growth stops, and it eventually will, and clearly temporarily it's going to stop right now, my estimates are, even if things kind of resolve, we're going to have a 8 to 10% drop in GDP this year. This is not a recession. This is a depression that we're in. But I do expect a recovery from this, because people aren't focused on finance right now. They're focused on a virus. So I think this is both a shot across the bow, and an opportunity to wake people up to the unsustainability of our system. But once growth stops, it has to first manifest in the financial system, because when money is created, first of all, there's no tether to underlying resources, and there hasn't been in a century. And second of all, when money's created, we don't create the interest. So every year, banks create more and more money around the world to facilitate commerce and technology and creativity and venture capital and all that. But the interest isn't created, which means next year there needs to be growth to pay back the interest. And so that's one of the first problems that we're going to have with this coronavirus is many areas, especially in the harder hit hot zones, as it were, the companies in those regions are going to be technically bankrupt. And some industries like cruise lines and airlines and transportation and entertainment, a lot of food service sort of things, technically they're not going to be able to cover their debt service. So this is where the credit market becomes really important. Um, we've lived in an era where you can always go to the bank and get credit. But if you make $100,000 a year, for example, you owe the bank $350,000 in debt, and now all of a sudden your income is in question and you're only making 80 or 70, but you still owe the bank 350. As an individual, we can see how that's a problem. But that same math, the 100 versus 350, that's what our global advanced economies are facing right now. So this all spells deflation in the financial system, but in my opinion, it's not the big deflation, which I think eventually we're going to have a return to 1990s level GDP per capita in advanced economies, which would be about a 30% drop, not an 8 to 10% drop. I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen because of this virus, but I think it is going to happen in the next decade, which is our work, Asher. This is what we've been trying to prepare people as individuals, as communities, and maybe as a nation. How the heck are we going to navigate that? And what it means is since you and I have been alive, not only have we been in this debt to GDP bubble, but we're also in this bubble where we've replaced social capital and social interactions with each other with money and technology. And I think that's going to have to reverse as well.
There's a lot there that I want to unpack. I mean, the first thing you
Yeah,
said
sorry.
was, yeah, it's fine. The first thing you said was, and I know it's hard I think we have to be careful about trying to predict exactly how things are going to unfold, but you talked about, the potential of an 8 to 10% decrease in GDP over, a relatively short period of time, and then maybe a recovery. That's something we haven't seen, right? In a
No, we
really
saw
long time.
a few percent in 2009. Recessions have been mild. The 1930s in America was 29.6% drop in GDP.
Right.
The Great Depression was around 30%.
Yeah.
But yeah, in our
Now,
lifetimes, we've not seen anything like that. This coronavirus, irrespective of any predictions I have large error bands on them because there's so much unknowns here. I'm not a biologist, epidemiologist, but I look at numbers and I talk to a lot of really smart people. We're probably going to have a couple million deaths globally from this. I don't think that is going to be the biggest story. The biggest story is going to be the economic impact, the supply chains, how global commerce is handled, and the emergent human response from what people start to do. You and I are now having professional interaction over Zoom. How many people are not traveling and using Zoom and being 90% as effective as if they flew to Paris? So I think there's going to be a lot of positives that come from it too. But back to your question, no, we are in uncharted territory. I think even if things resolve and we get through the next month of quarantines and things, I think some V-shaped recovery like people are talking about, there's no freaking way that's going to happen because people have already kind of psychologically shifted their mindset, and China is coming back. They're up to maybe 70% of the thermal footprint of a year ago. They were down to below 50% at one point. I don't know how much of that is factories just lighting up without employees, but I really think there is not going to be a V-shaped recovery this time.
yeah, I mean, so there's a big question there in terms of when people get back to quote unquote life as usual, right? And if they do, um, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the interventions that, so in the Great Recession, there was massive intervention that happened, right, to bail out the banks, with quantitative easing and all these really unprecedented interventions. Now we see, the Fed slashing interest rates to virtually zero, right? And the reaction of the market is not what they're hoping for, right?
Yeah, that's a real dangerous situation because keep in mind, right now as we speak, the S&P is at 2,500. So that's still almost 400% what it was in 2009. And yet the Fed's out of bullets.
Right.
They've just eased to 0%. They're doing $1 trillion in repo every day. They've opened up huge swap lines for international dollar shortages, et cetera. What do they do next? All they could do now is expand quantitative easing beyond treasuries and mortgages. They could go to municipals and then start buying corporate bonds and then start buying stocks like the Japanese government does. But we would have to go through Congress to change the Federal Reserve Act for them to buy stocks. And I don't know how much of a difference it would make anyways. So right now, the Fed is done about all it can do other than maybe the big bazooka, which is have the government spend money on infrastructure and social dislocations, issue large bonds to do that, and then have the Fed monetize it, directly add that to their balance sheet. So monetizing the deficit, I think that's possible. Beyond the Fed, though, we need the Treasury and the fiscal authorities to start intervening. And you've seen the talks about eliminating the payroll tax. I don't think that's sufficient. I think they're going to have to do some form of universal basic income.
Yeah.
Hong Kong did that a little while ago. You give $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever it is to every citizen, because this is going to really lay bare the wealth and income inequality in our country. And seriously, like I watched the debate last night with Bernie and Biden. They brought it up often that half of our country effectively has nothing. And now with this, that's not a good situation. So we're going to have to directly support Main Street instead of Wall Street. And I do agree with what Biden said last night, that had we not done the TARP program in 2008, that all those people would have been out of jobs because the financial system would have collapsed. So I agree we need to support the systemic underpinnings of the economy, but we need to do it in a smarter way. And here, we've totally wasted the interviewing 11 years. Went back on our credit cards and continued our casino
We had the
funneling economy.
longest run of growth in the markets ever, right?
But it was fake growth.
Yeah.
It was largely led by China following our debt to GDP model on steroids. And because so much of the demand of commodities in the world was due to their 600-700% of debt versus GDP creation every year.
We've become more
So,
dependent on China and in the global, supply chains.
well, that's the other thing, is that hopefully that is a wake-up call. I've talked to a lot of people from many different political stripes, not just post-carbon flavor. And a lot of people are like, how did we get to this situation where 70% or 80% of the world's pharmaceutical inputs are made in China? Even if we buy drugs from India, the components are made in China. And the answer is we've been following this neoliberal model of maximizing monetary efficiency. And we've done that at a cost to resilience. And so I think people are starting to think about that. Right now, because of this crisis, we could make stuff, especially basic essential needs in America, and tighten our supply chains. In Oregon, where you live, make things between British Columbia, California, and Idaho, shrink the supply chains. And you know what? Things are going to cost 2 or 3 times more, but they're going to be safer, more resilient, more longer-term sustainable than having micro components made in South Korea, Japan, Bangladesh, et cetera. And I still think we have no idea what the supply chain shortfalls are going to be. When the Fukushima tsunami hit, 2 weeks later, Ford had to stop producing black trucks. We have no idea yet, because it hasn't been long enough, what sort of miniature components that might seem trivial, but you need a spark plug to start a tractor, for example. And we don't know how that's going to unfold in the coming months.
Yeah. Let's talk about energy for a second, because we've
Yeah.
also seen a lot of dramatic things happening with the oil markets. Now, we have Post Carbon talk a lot about the unique role that oil plays in the global economy and in the world that we've built, and the challenges of substituting it, particularly when we think about the need to substitute from a climate perspective. We've seen with oil markets being hit hard by demand reduction, but also what's happening in terms of, and I don't know, I'm not there behind the scenes between OPEC and Russia and all these geopolitical moves that these countries are trying to play. But the growth that we've seen in oil supplies over the last decade or so has really been on the back of tight oil here in the United States, right? And that industry has grown tremendously. We've heard lots of talk about, energy independence and energy security in the United States, and all the benefits of us, fracking our way, to becoming the number one, oil producing nation in the world. And we've talked a lot about the risks of that because of the geology, the unique characteristics of shales, in terms of their steep decline rates, and the fact that you basically have to keep growing your drilling rates in order just to maintain production. But this industry has been basically propped up with cheap debt for a long time. A lot of the industry hasn't been, making a profit, and for a long time, and that's when prices were higher. Now prices have cratered. So what does it mean, both, I think, just in terms of like oil production in the United States, but also what are the risks of that if the shale boom goes bust, really soon because of this.
Yeah, it's a huge story. It's kind of bizarre that oil is the hemoglobin of modern societies, and right now it's $29 a barrel. It's the single most important commodity to our system. And this entire thing is a net energy story, in the same way that a cheetah chases a gazelle, and then the gazelles become more scarce and it has to chase a rabbit using the same, almost as much energy, but getting much fewer calories. This whole story is declining benefits from energy to human economies. And you know, we are having to pay $60 in the United States, plus or minus, for the average barrel of oil to extract. Yet we're only getting $29 a barrel. So not only that, but a lot of that money helped our economies. So in versus 15 years ago, we were importing a great amount of our oil. Now we're producing a huge amount of our oil. So if that production gets cut, it's all those service industries linked to the energy companies. Those people are out of business, or at least going to have severely truncated business. So I think this cements November 2018 as the date of global peak oil, because already we have rapidly declining uh, um, rates of shale, and the aggregate decline rate of the world is quite high, 6% or something like that. But what's now happening is at such low prices, we have no upstream signal to invest. So this means that we've been on this treadmill in the United States, getting more and more credit to the shale drillers, and they're able to drill more, even though it's costly, to increase or hold constant production. Well, now at $30, who's going to be investing the amount that we need to keep production flat or maybe increasing in the next decade? Hardly anyone. There's going to be vast fire sales of the industry that's most important to our economy. I think eventually they're going to have to nationalize the remaining oil and gas resources in the United States, because a dollar of oil or gas is far more important than a dollar of dog food. Well, not in my household, but a dollar of muffins or cheesecake or whatever else. And you're going to see that. I mean, we're already bailing out the cruise lines, which I think is a mistake. We don't need Carnival cruises. We do need crude oil and its derivatives. So I think Russia is just clicking their heels and smiling, because due to our boycotts and embargoes on them, they've, in the last decade, they've had to become self-reliant, design their own technology, their own supply chains, and they have a lot of oil and gas left. So when they see oil down here, that's actually good for them longer term strategically. I think it's really kind of risky with the Middle East. Saudi Arabia certainly can produce oil a lot cheaper than the United States, but they have huge social programs that depend on the oil revenues from the government. So I think that's not something that we're focusing on today. We're talking about the medical system and prescriptions and supply chains and poverty and the financial system. But I think this is really scary, what's happening to the energy sector, because we are going to need more oil in the future. Not more than we have today, but we're going to need some oil, obviously. And this is putting the industry in a really precarious position. I mean, I can't imagine any companies in the United States that are making money at $29 oil.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about bailing out cruise lines. We've already heard that the government's considering bailing out the shale industry as well. I mean, I would not be surprised to see that happening. The timing is an interesting question, because right now it's hard to imagine demand as long as the virus is still a major risk for us. And there is a question about whether or not, it will be a couple months and then go away and then come back, or, we don't really know. I certainly don't know. I'm not an expert on that. But right now, even if you tried to shore those up, give them infusion of cash or whatever it is, the demand isn't not necessarily there for it because people are
No,
staying home.
and that's such a paradoxical thing for our group of analysts and people that you and I have been working with, because we recognize the importance of energy to our lives. We recognize that we're living through the peak of the carbon pulse. Maybe not this year, but these decades are the peak of global human access to fossil sunlight. But paradoxically, if oil is peaked in 2018, which I think is highly likely, people expect that we'll have higher prices once supplies have peaked. But we're actually going to have lower prices, and I expect we're going to have low prices for a very long time. Why? Because we've over time created more and more financial claims on our economy, and those are deflating. And so financial depletion is happening much more rapidly than oil depletion. And so we're going to have this deflationary pulse in commodities for some time. I think at some point in the next decade, we're going to really have a financial reckoning where the use of credit, the institution of finance itself is going to come under question. I don't think that's going to happen right now. And me saying this on your podcast isn't going to change people's minds about that. But the reason I bring it up is I think at that moment, there's going to be an incredible opportunity. And that opportunity is if people understand the relationship between price, cost, and value, and how critical energy is to our society, yet we have $20 oil or whatever it is. At that moment, only at that moment, can we put a massive tax on non-renewable inputs, not just oil, but gas and coal, and well, hopefully not much coal either, copper and phosphorus and anything that's non-renewable. Once we have this deflationary pulse, we put a tax on it. And we put the tax that would equate it with the renewable equivalent. And therefore, renewables and fossil fuels are on a better comparison. And so then we can actually figure out ways how to increase the amount of renewables in our system. And that will, of course, be a regressive thing. So we're going to have to balance that with some sort of social basic income and things like that. But those are the sort of ways that I think we can use this as a possible way to steer society in a better path going forward, because there's no way we could do a carbon tax right now. Politically, it would be a frozen thing, because right now, I mean, people want subsidies. They're going to be broke and wanting handouts as opposed to taxes. But the only way to do it in the long run would be some sort of tax.
Yeah, and I guess where I want to end is thinking a little bit. It's early, obviously, and there are a lot more acute concerns right now that we all face. But trying to think a little bit about the lessons out of this, and maybe some positive course correction that can come. So here we have a situation where the number one priority is to stop this virus in its tracks, which means we're, whether we mandate it or we, strongly encourage it, and different governments are doing this differently. We're asking people to effectively step out of the global economy, pull themselves out. We've got an economy that's really dependent upon consumption, and that means us out there purchasing things, buying stuff, right? And what we're asking people to do instead now is to retrench, right? Just focus on the immediate needs and practice social isolation, and that means that we're saying that we are going to really hurt the economy in the short run in order to hopefully save ourselves in the long run. And for me, it's like, as somebody who's very concerned about the climate crisis And we've been, those of us who've been concerned about the climate crisis have been trying to warn people for a while, we need to take drastic measures, to try to mitigate the climate crisis. So we can actually have a planet, a climate that is viable for us and other species, right? So now some advocate for what they think of as kind of painless solutions. We could just substitute renewables, for fossil fuels. We can create, a whole wave of green jobs. They focus on sort of the positive way of doing that. I think those of us who maybe are a little bit more steeped in understanding the role of energy and the challenge of the energy transition might say, no, what we actually need to do is to address our dependence on growth, right, and consumption, and get to that. So maybe, if we are suddenly able to take drastic action, things that were inconceivable, right, just a month ago, we're doing now, okay, to deal with this crisis. And we have another threat. We have other threats, which are climate crisis, our dangerous dependence on, non-renewable resources, a global economy that needs to keep growing, in order to survive. Those are all threats to us. Can we learn from this experience so that we basically say, yeah, we don't need to go on cruises. We don't need to get on an airplane all the time. We don't need to do all these things, and that let's use these resources for the better good. Let's relocalize, production of things. Let's kind of reorient, the economy to what's important. I know this sounds maybe too optimistic on my part, but what do you think about, or are those lessons that we could learn, and how would we learn those lessons?
Yeah, that's a huge question. My work from the past, that I've modeled global human society as a dissipative structure, that we collaborate and cooperate towards surplus, and that's linked to energy. And so the global society functions like a superorganism. Right now, the superorganism is checked into the hospital and is getting treated for a virus. And the question is after it's discharged from the hospital, which might be in a couple months or maybe next year, we don't know, will it listen to its doctors, who are ecologists and biophysical economists and psychologists, or will it go back to its gluttonous ways? It wasn't that long ago, the Madrid climate talks, where China said, we cannot reduce emissions. It is impossible. We're sorry, we care about climate change. We cannot reduce emissions. And their emissions were down 40% in the first quarter or something like that. So we can reduce emissions.
Yeah.
It's just not in a way that continues what our global culture is seeking. Here's another concept. You've heard in the news the last few days about flattening the curve, where if we do nothing and keep the economy going, the medical system is going to be overwhelmed because so many people are going to be sick, and some percentage are going to have to go to the hospital, and some percentage are going to have to go in an intensive care. We have 2.8 beds per thousand in the United States for ICU. And so if we stay at home and don't go to public gatherings, and we shut down schools and concerts and basketball games, that we flatten the curve. Well, right there, we are throttling down the metabolism of our society with volition. We are consciously choosing to reduce how much energy the superorganism eats. So right there is a positive example. I will say, though, that I think flattening that curve, which is the intake into hospitals, is going to also steepen and maybe collapse some other curves, which is something that's very worrisome to me. Is that truly, if we quarantine economies like Italy has done, then we really run the risk of supply chain and financial breakdowns. So I don't know what the answer there is. I think somewhat of a middle ground is going to have to be the answer. I think as individuals, we can choose to live differently. I think once the crisis is over and oil and gas and commodities are going to be this low, the default of our system is going to be to go back to the other system, which is why the work of resilience and post-carbon is so critical now, because we need to own this narrative that humans can get their evolutionary neurotransmitters of our ancestors in ways that don't need this much energy and throughput. And I think we have to learn from experience that that's the case, because the ultimate goal here, we're not going to solve climate change by switching to solar panels. We're going to solve climate change and some of the longer term issues by changing our system, by linking our cultural goal to something other than just an energetic measure of GDP, which is basically GDB, gross domestic burning. Every single good and service that contributes to GDP, there's a fire somewhere in the economy that built it. We need to get away from that and look at the things that really give us the same feelings that our ancestors did. Like my little dog Frank here. Frank, say hi to the camera. Hello. So I think, for example, one thing my girlfriend and I decided to do, we're self-quarantining. I'm doing work from home. We have like 10 years of frozen goods in our freezer in the basement. So every night we're alternating. She's cooking one night, I'm cooking the other night. We're going through our freezer until it's empty. We're not going to the grocery store. It just, that's going to be boring after a while. And some of the stuff's of several years old, but we're just doing that as a way to throttle down our own consumption, not to save money or to not get the disease, but just as an exercise in discipline. But I do think we need to use this as a wake-up call that we probably don't need to consume as much to be as happy. And then the more people that recognize that as individuals, the more constituency there is, and the more people are open to different futures. I still, Asher, don't think we're going to voluntarily degrow as a society. We're going to have events like this that notch down our metabolism. We're going to learn, we're going to have new models of doing things that people are going to say, yeah, let's try that. And it's going to evolve stepwise like that. I really am skeptical that we're going to say, let's shrink our economy, because the underlying superorganism dynamic of our current culture is like a beach ball in a pool, and you can push it down, but it springs right back up. So I think the challenge is, how do we put in speed bumps and airbags culturally in a governance way that doesn't allow us to consume at the levels that we have been, because things are taxed or subsidized and there's a different rule structure. Right now it's like, let's just open the casino of the United States and Disneyland, and that's what we've been doing the last 10 years. So I'm hopeful that this is really a wake-up call where people start to realize the fragility of our system, and that once basic needs are met, the best things in life are free.
Yeah, and I also hope that we recognize that we're not going to be okay as individuals, or our families are not going to be okay if everyone else is not okay also, right? I mean, this health crisis
Exactly. I think that's a really critical point, is that, and this is another place where post-carbon can take a leadership role, is this is cooperative, we're all in this together. And I think the default is that the guns, gold, and Bitcoin sort of individualistic, I'm hoarding my toilet paper sort of reaction. We need to think about community, that the people that live within a half mile of your house, those are the people that you're going to navigate this with. At a very minimum, get out and start talking to them about these issues. And I think we have to think much more in community terms than individual terms. As individuals, even under a Mad Max scenario, that's not going to be good, because you break your leg, you're going to need a doctor. I mean, we need to save the whole ship and cooperate together to navigate not only this crisis, but the whole roller coaster of coming decades.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I'd say we're in for a roller coaster ride. That's clear. We don't know, what the next, days, weeks, months are going to bring us. We all need to stay safe. It's kind of a paradox where we recognize that we're going to have to get through this crisis and the other more systemic crises we face together. And at the same time, we need to be practicing social distancing right now. So
I
yes,
know.
talk with other folks about this, but maybe at a 6 foot distance outside at the park, you know?
Well, I've read about people around that are organizing WhatsApp groups in their neighborhood and having little Zoom calls, and they're coming up with creative ways. I mean, I think the time now isn't to think, how can I best prepare myself to hunker down for the long run. I think it's how can I play a role in my community, not only in this challenge, but in future ones. And I really think it's a perilous time to be alive, and it's an amazing time to be alive. And I hope, some of your listeners take it upon themselves to play a leadership role, if not in their own family, then their own community, etc. There's a lot we can do. We've just kind of been sleepwalking through this consumptive era of our culture.
Yeah. Well, hopefully folks are waking up right now. Thanks for your time, Nate. And
You're
I'm sure I'll
welcome,
talk to
man.
you soon. Okay.
Okay,
Thanks.
cheers.